Justify. Prove to be right or reasonable. Justification is at the heart of all legal and political argument. But at a time when argument itself is slave to appearances, it is time to bring back a culture of justification. Justify, a podcast on law and politics in India from the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, hosted by Arghya Sengupta.
Welcome to Justify. As India prepares to go to the polls, this season is dedicated to examining issues of law and policy, which, in our view, should affect the youth vote in the upcoming elections. 2024 has been declared a super election year with close to 2 billion people around the world going to the ballot. It's happening in 64 countries, of which almost half are just in India. The Indian elections will not just determine the future course of national politics, but also global developments as well. The key question this time, as it has been over the last three general election cycles, is the role of the media and the freedom of the press to shape public narratives. The Reuters Digital Report 2023 states that the overall trust of all Indians in the media is about 38%. A perception of media bias may lead to youth getting their information from other sources, as it happens commonly, whether it is social media or otherwise, and other informal circles which are not really reputed for ethical journalism. This means that young voters may be swayed with misinformation, and the Election Commission is keen that we set this right. To discuss these issues on the role of media and how it is in India today and how it might shape elections, I have the pleasure of introducing Vibodh Parthasarathi. Vibodh is an associate professor at the Center for Culture, Media and Governance at Jamia Millia Islamia and serves as associate editor of the Journal of Digital Media and Policy. He maintains a multidisciplinary interest in media policy, creative industries, and digital transitions. Thank you for joining me on Justify, Vibodh. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me on this, Argo. I look forward to the conversation.
So let's start with the question, the vexed question of ownership. Considering the fact that most large Indian media houses are owned by big corporate groups, can we really afford to think of the freedom of press in the context of freedom from government? Or should we be seeing it in a more multifaceted manner in terms of freedom from excessive concentration of power?
Yeah, I think I would like to sort of begin by emphasizing that, prominent news outlets are actually owned by family-controlled business groups and not corporations in the true sense of the word there. And this has been a tradition in post-47 India. So, for example, if you look at the 1950s, the groups that owned prominent newspapers were also the same very groups that owned leading business houses. And this kind of ownership had sort of dwindled by the 70s and 80s. And it's largely because these business groups had exited their other non-news businesses. So Times of India and Indian Express being examples of that. And then they, of course, became purely news outlets. But this, the earlier phenomena, seems to have sort of come back over the last 15 years, where prominent news media outlets are being owned by leading family-controlled business groups, both in print and in broadcast news. So that trend definitely is a bit of a worry, something which we had thought we had got over in the 1950s, seems to have come back in the early decade of the current century.
And what, in your view, could possibly explain this, as in this desire for large business groups to, again, go back to owning news outlets, something that they had stopped doing? Of course, the big elephant in the room here is Adani's takeover of NDTV, but there are several others that we could discuss. What, in your view, possibly explains this?
So the traditional, of course, argument was that business wanted voice in the press to try and amplify its own concerns and fortify its own interests. And I think that's why we would see that the news enterprises or the news undertakings of business groups were a very small part uh, of the many undertakings owned by these business groups. And very often they were also the most lucrative, the least lucrative parts, I beg your pardon, of these business groups. Yeah. So why would a diversified business group then venture into a particular sector which is not lucrative? Yeah. And of course, the answer to that, as far as I'm concerned, is that they would want a voice and a means to shape public opinion. Yeah. Uh, but of course, over the years, one has seen that these business groups have other mechanisms to influence public opinion and also more directly, perhaps, public policy itself. So that sort of is one kind of explanation in terms of why business groups are there in the media. This is also the case in other countries as well, especially in different parts of the global south. But it's also there in countries like Italy, for example, where you have business groups are owning prominent news outlets. Yeah. Um, the other reason, in a sense, why business groups have tended to venture into the news media is that that then tends to become the playing field for their contests with rival business groups. Yeah. And this we saw very clearly in the 1980s there, when two different business groups, which were severely competing in the textile sectors, were sort of, had developed very close relationships with two different types of newspaper houses there. So the second, therefore, is that does the ways in which a newspaper undertaking of a business group is leveraged for competitive purposes versus vis-a-vis their other rivals in other sectors of the economy. I would also imagine that the sort of third reason, which we have seen largely in the last 20 years post-broadcasting, is that these business groups tend to feel that amplifying the voice and the interests of the governments of the day could lead to quid pro quo benefits, again, in their non-news business undertakings. So I think there are these three different kinds of reasons why I would see a business group investing in an undertaking which is much smaller than their other undertakings and definitely far less lucrative than those other undertakings.
And what, in your view, does that do to press freedom? It would, of course, be a simplistic conclusion to say that because it is now a media house is owned by a business group, it is not free and it will to the master's voice in that sense, and will say exactly what the business group wants to be said. But if that were the case, then obviously there is no freedom because everything is owned by somebody or the other, and that somebody or the other has some interests or the other that might exist. So, do you sense a greater threat to the freedom of the press with large business houses coming back into the fold and owning news media outlets?
Yeah, I think this is very important because the traditional and the default threat to press freedom was the state. Um, um, and therefore, debates around press freedom centered around the ways in which the press could be fortified from governments and its various arms. Yeah. But I think subsequently it was also realized that there are other actors who might constrain press freedom. So, for example, advertisers, who together with advertising also tend to constrain press freedom. Yeah. It was also realized that impediments to press freedom could come from formal political actors and narrow sectional interests in society. Yeah. But all through these debates globally, um, there has been an emphasis that different aspects of ownership do tend to constrain press freedom. And therefore, we're looking at the relationship between proprietors and editors, and how does that relationship then shape the relationship between editors and journalists, or how the relationship between proprietors and their other business interests might shape the relationship with the editors, how the relationship between proprietors and advertisers, again, shape their relationship with their uh, professionals in the news business. Yeah. So I think it's a complex territory. I don't think that there could be a simple correlation in terms of the interests of the proprietor by themselves, completely shaping what editors do or don't do, and what journalists do and are asked not to do here.
That's right. Let's try and unpack that. As you said, it's a complex territory. Let's try and unpack that with an example of my hometown paper, the one that I grew up reading, The Telegraph. Now, The Telegraph has largely been seen as an anti-establishment paper. That is, if you consider the establishment to be the Delhi establishment, it's a strongly anti-establishment paper. You see a certain slant as in its articles, which is seen as heavily critical of the NDA government. It has also at the same time been seen as going easy on the local Trinamool Congress government in West Bengal. A lot of people see this as the epitome of press freedom, that in an otherwise stultified environment, there is a large newspaper that can be openly critical of the government. Others see this as polarization in its own way, because there is a slant in its writings that always makes the BJP look bad and most of the time makes the Trinamool Congress look good. It is, of course, an old newspaper owned by a old news family. In that sense, what you said, not a large corporate group, but an old family-owned newspaper with a strong and long tradition of editorial independence. So, how would you characterize this kind of case? Would you see this as an example of what press freedom should be like? Would you see this as kind of ensuring that there is no middle ground, there is no real independence, but the papers are being pushed to the left or the right and being forced to choose? Or is there any third way in which you would like to view this?
So I think to begin with, the example which you gave of the Telegraph, which is I think owned by the ABP Group, they don't seem to have substantial interests outside the media. So perhaps the kind of dependencies that comparable newspaper groups would have, they are sort of bereft of that. Yeah. And I think this phenomena could be perhaps seen slightly wider as well. So, for example, in Maharashtra, you have the Sakal Media Group, which again is a regional media group, in that sense, regional in terms of its footprint. Um, it does, of course, have interests outside the news business here, especially in the realm of formal politics here. And what is interesting about Sakal was that Sakal actually began as a trust newspaper. And then I think in the early 1980s, it was acquired by a political family. And I would imagine there also one could see these tensions between the way in which, uh, being a regional newspaper, it might want to glorify and fortify what they see as regional interests, vis-a-vis different kinds of intrusions which are coming from the center. And I think this phenomena is pretty much widespread when we look at the remaining independent, as in non-business owned newspaper groups in different parts of the country. So, for example, the other case which came up, which comes up quite often as a textbook case, is the case of Inadu in Andhra Pradesh. Okay? And of course, that was an undertaking of a group which had many other kinds of business interests, including in the media and outside the news business here. And they, of course, were pretty much supportive of the regional governments at a time when Indian federalism was sort of moving in the direction that we see today. Then, of course, you would have sort of regional groups which began as regional groups, but then have developed an audiences across India. There, of course, Hindu would be the exemplar. Unlike the ABP, again, it does not have any interests outside the news business here. So I think the tension that you talked about between regional media groups and the central powers as far as this country is concerned. That tension, to a large extent, depends again on what kind of non-news interests, political interests, financial interests, commercial interests that these groups tend to own. Yeah.
That's
Uh,
right. I think it points to a sorry state for the rule of law because, of course, groups which have interests outside the media being more towing the line of the government obviously means that it's really not the law that prevails, but it's connections that prevail, at least in the perception of these groups. But I want to bring in the elephant in the room here, which is social media. Given the fact that the government now has a direct channel to reach the the citizens of the country, and we can see with Prime Minister Modi being such an effective social media player. There has been a tradition, there has been an argument that's been made that governments don't require the media in order to shape the narrative in a way in which they did before. And of course, there's a kernel of truth to that because now you've removed the intermediary in some sense. Of course, there is another intermediary in terms of the social media platform, but we leave that aside for the moment. But you can directly, in some sense, communicate to the citizens. Given the development of social media, how do you think this has or has not affected the way in which these large media houses have operated? Do you see them also trying to jump onto the bandwagon and ensuring that they also have a significant digital presence? Do you see that this makes them more amenable to what the government has been saying or doing because they feel threatened by the rise of social media? How has social media changed, if at all, this dynamic between the media house and the government?
Yeah, I think here again, perhaps to try and look a little bit back in time, I think similar kinds of apprehensions were there in the 80s with the Rajiv Gandhi government. Okay, and we tend to forget the fact that, Doordarshan was nicknamed as Rajiv Darshan. And that was one way in which the government of the day wanted to sort of bypass or sidestep the private owned media at that point of time, which was newspapers only, to reach out to their audiences directly, as directly as a broadcast signal can reach audiences there. So I think that there is a certain precedent I see as far as the state is concerned, which has always been trying to find ways to directly reach citizens. Mm. And in that process, perhaps try to bypass, in some cases, complement what amicable forces in the media are doing. Yeah. But of course, the social media is a totally different kind of dynamic that we've seen. Because here, I think the state is trying to reach out to the citizens in their individual capacity, as opposed to that in the case of broadcasting, where the state tried to reach out to audiences as this collective, sort of anonymous kind of mass. And that, of course, then changes the way in which this kind of messaging takes place. It also is able to calibrate what kind of messaging could be uh, funneled towards what kind of audiences in which parts of the country. So in broadcasting terms, you could say that the idea of narrowcasting has sort of come back with the state's use of social media. And that perhaps would be, in a sense, a concern, I would imagine, for the so-called mainstream media itself here. So does the government bypassing them, in a sense, also indicate that the government itself has lost trust in the media? You began this discussion by saying that, audiences have lost trust in the media because they are not delivering what they want. In this case, perhaps one could try and make a case that, the state is adopting social media because the kind of the mainstream news outlets are now not able to perhaps deliver as well, or as personally, or with that kind of emotion as the way in which social media perhaps can do. And this perhaps is, in a sense, a scenario which is rather worrying for the nature of the fourth estate itself. Because if the first estate tends to take on some of the functions which are traditionally being carried out by the fourth estate, then perhaps you have to go back and rethink about the relationship between these estates in the constitution of our democracy, or at any democracy at any moment of time. Yeah. So that for me perhaps is the big concern, that what does it mean for the state to take on certain kinds of fourth estate functions, perhaps even replace those fourth estate functions by their own.
That's right. So if we do look at the ad spends on television channels that state governments have done over the course of the last few years, it would seem that their belief in the media or their reliance on the media is still pretty solid. If you look at the UP government, they spend about 160 crores on advertisements in newspaper in on TV channels alone in 2021. That's a huge amount of money to be spending on advertisements only on news channels. And the Delhi government has a budget of 997 crores for the last 6 or 7 years. I mean, these are large numbers and they cut across party lines in terms of what's been going on. So it seems as if the reliance on traditional media is perhaps still there in some form, but with social media, as in you have this additional channel where also the spending is pretty significant. I was seeing West Bengal on Facebook ads alone had spent about 4 crores in one poll campaign. So again, it may seem like a small amount of money, but only on Facebook ads actually is pretty significant. So it seems like another channel has been opened up for the government, and in this case, a channel that make sure that all their eggs are not in one basket, which is of the traditional media house. But that actually brings me to an equally interesting question: is that what happens when social media becomes more and more relevant, particularly when as it has in the case of poll campaigns, uh, in relation to the relationship that the government has with Twitter or Facebook or the large social media intermediaries that we are talking about. Uh, at the two biggest channels of dissemination digitally during elections are WhatsApp and YouTube. Both of them are owned by large corporations outside India. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit from your own work as well as work that you've studied in terms of this relationship between big tech and government. Does it necessarily become cozy as a relation as a result of this growth of social media, or do you see other forces at play?
Yeah, so just going back to the figures that you sort of talked about in terms of expenditure, and these are quite startling, and they're perhaps more startling because they don't include figures for out-of-home advertising, for example.
That's right.
So things like hoardings and so on and so forth, which again, it started, of course, in South India, and then that's something which has sort of moved across the country. Yeah. So that's an additional kind of way in which the state is trying to reach out. Yeah. The second point sort of is that, again, I mean, this is something perhaps, you might know better. What does this relationship between the fourth estate, the first estate and the fourth estate, tell us about the normative principle of the separation of powers? Okay, so that's one kind of way in which this debate could go. As far as social media itself is concerned, yes, there seems to be a dependency between channels of information dissemination, which are privately held, and the state. It's just that traditionally, these channels of information dissemination were Indian entities, and they were sort of physically located almost completely in the Indian jurisdiction. Yeah. With the example that you're talking about, both whether it's Google or Facebook, there is a different kind of dynamics unfolding, in the sense that here, the kind of sovereign state seems to rely on non-state actors located in other jurisdictions to amplify their messaging within the home jurisdiction. Yeah. What does it do, A, to the relationship between big tech and the government? Is this relationship bidirectional? Are we perhaps talking about what big tech might actually gain by being part of this process? Or are we thinking only that the state is the one who's going to gain, the regime of the day is going to gain by relying on this? Yeah. And perhaps it seems to be that these relationships appears to be largely bidirectional there. I think both actors, one way or the other, are gaining from this relationship as it gets stronger because both tend to benefit from it. Okay, so this kind of surge that we see in the consumption of social media in run-ups towards elections, yeah, while for the state that perhaps amplifies their messaging, and I guess for the big tech players, that's perhaps one way in which they also get a surge in their own popularity. Yeah. So there is business sense on one side, there is political sense on the other side, and perhaps what happens when these two tend to overlap is something which we need to think about there, especially given the issues of jurisdiction that are involved here. Yeah. And this is again perhaps happening in other parts of the world as well. We are not unique on this. Yeah. In different parts of the world, you have governments who tend to rely on foreign non-state actors for matters of information amplification and dissemination, and in many cases, even access to information.
That's right. I just find it curious that, in India, where we are always afraid of the foreign hand affecting domestic politics, when it comes to social media, it seems that all political parties are rushing to embrace the foreign hand and making sure that the foreign hand is working in their interest. Such is the paradoxical nature of our politics. But as you said, with the growth of social media, and particularly in election time, and this bidirectional relationship that has emerged between social media companies as well and governments, we have seen certain pernicious practices that have emerged. We have seen the emergence of deep fakes, which have been a massive problem. This is, as you said, not just in elections in India. Uh, every subsequent election everywhere in the world throws up more and more instances of misinformation, of which deepfakes is one kind, which can easily sway particular voters to vote in one direction or the other. Now, at this juncture, given where we are, what role do you think stakeholders can play? And this is not just governments in terms of regulation, but also big tech players themselves and civil society to ensure that the media continues to remain a conduit of information and not misinformation. And this, maybe you can take it in two parts, as in what can social media companies do? That's one. And two is what can traditional media houses do, which of course do perform a gatekeeper role, given the fact that there is this proliferation of misinformation which occurs on the digital media.
Yeah, so I think on this misinformation thing, I would sort of try and put this problem in a slightly different way. Yeah. What we see today is a kind of is a market of information which is providing two different types of products. Yeah. One is the product which is provided by orthodox actors who are supposed to maintain professional standards and protocols of the news media. Yeah. Okay. Of course, nonetheless, there are numerous cases of bias and abuse in that activity as well. Yeah. But that's one kind of market. What was a sort of traditional market for true and genuine information. Yeah. And then we have this other market of information that is coming from various types of unorthodox quarters. Yeah. Okay. And these two markets of information are competing for the attention of audiences. Yeah, that's the way I kind of see it. So when I get up in the morning and I look at the news which is coming on WhatsApp? I'm not on any other social media. Is that the market I first plug into, or do I plug into the market of a professionally run news website, newspaper, and a broadcaster? And I think these two markets are very strongly competing against each other at one level. Yeah. And I think what is significant for me here is the fact that to continue the sort of the line of argument here, that if there is a market in which the supply of quality products becomes scarce, then audiences would turn to other sources, which may provide suboptimum or even fake products. Okay, this, for example, we clearly saw when India was a closed economy. The whole idea of, through pirated or unorthodox networks to try and get commodities which were coming from the outside. Yeah, so that kind of market grew largely because supply was getting constrained there. And quite clearly, that market actually dwindled in many ways, at least in many sectors, it dwindled when the supply was opened up there. So I think the question here, of course, is that what could traditional news media players do to try and recover that attention which they've lost to these unorthodox players? Yeah. And I think that's where the issue of building a quality product becomes important, because if you're not getting quality from one market, then you'll try and settle for a quality from another market. Yeah, especially, of course, you are not paying for products in the other market as well. Yeah,
That's right. I mean,
so in terms of the kind of economics of information, I see a very strange sort of scenario which is emerging here, that there are incentives for one market to grow because of the lack of quality in the other market, A, and B, that one market is growing also because products which are coming from there are effectively at a zero cost basis for the audience.
That's right. And I think that's an interesting paradox. And from a point of view of a person, and I wake up in the morning and I do still read the newspaper, uh, and I think I do it because of one, to get a breadth of information, which is not available to me on my social media channels, which seems always like a snapshot that is curated for me, whether accurately or not. And secondly, as you said, in terms of quality, as in the on social media, as in the quality would be for mixed nature, it would depend on what exactly is linked. Whereas with the newspapers, quality good or bad, it's a predictable quality. Let's put it that way.
So that's
But
an important point which you made, that about the quality being relatively predictable, whether good or bad. But I think that also links to the sort of third important dimension here, is that there are still relatively a large number of these orthodox players,
that's right.
irrespective of their health and hygiene. Okay.
Yeah, that's
Whereas,
right. I mean, India still seems to be a market where print news readership is growing. As it's
and I mean, broadcast viewership is pretty high compared to that of digital viewership. I mean, if we read the figures in a particular way, yeah. But on the other hand, the channels of distribution of news from unorthodox sources, that market is highly oligopolistic, if not a duopolistic. Okay,
and why
so
do you say it's oligopolistic?
because I think you have a far smaller number of players who are supplying such information. Yeah. So you talked about WhatsApp, you talked about Twitter, you talked about
But
YouTube.
someone might say, if they were going to argue that, someone might say that actually everyone is a supplier of news. You are a supplier of news. I'm a supplier of news. WhatsApp is only a intermediary, but the
Yeah, so the
supplier of
channels,
news
so the
is
channels of
because there are
supplying such news, the channels of supplying such news are far limited
Hmm.
than the channels through which one can try and get news from orthodox sources. That's the kind of argument one is making there.
Right.
It's not about what is actually being loaded on those channels there. So yes, everybody, in a sense, or at least a large number of people, are potentially able to express their views through on social media. Whether that gets equally delivered, whether that gets equally amplified, is something which is where I think the oligopoly aspect comes in. Yeah, because if they are not very many people. So, for example, if you have a limited number of, let's say you have only two social media entities, okay, and if one of them perhaps is needlessly amplifying or slanting a certain kind of speech, okay, then you might go to the other. If the other is doing the same, you really don't have a third option. Okay. Whereas with newspapers, perhaps that the number of products which I can perhaps solicit to appease myself are relatively more,
That's
uh,
right.
even
I,
if their products are not perhaps equally good. Yeah.
that's right. And I think here you make a pretty important point. I mean, perhaps it's slightly reminiscent of what Donald Trump was saying, that social media platforms are not pure intermediaries. If they were pure intermediaries, which is essentially a channel for communication, then I guess that this problem really wouldn't arise, because you would essentially be getting unfiltered content from whoever it is that is supplying that information. But given the fact that they are performing a gatekeeper function of some kind, uh, I mean, it may not necessarily be in that sense biased because of extraneous motivations. It may just be the way in which the algorithm is trained. It believes that it is supplying what is most accurate without any intention of trying to influence you in any way. But because of that fact that it's performing a gatekeeper function, there could be this slant that I may or may not like. So, is it your view that social media companies are not pure intermediaries, but are actually performing some kind of gatekeeper function, if I were to be easy on them, or if I were to be a little bit more harsh, kind of editorial function?
So I'll use a third word. I use the word that they do have a mediating role to play.
A
Okay,
mediating
a
role.
mediating role to play. So so
Quite
they are
kind.
kind of mediating. They're not being strict gatekeepers in a sense that it's not that certain content is kept out and certain is allowed, but perhaps the ease at which one can access certain kind of content may be different from the way in which you can ease other kind of content. So I think that's more of a kind of a mediating role. Editorial role perhaps is another kind of extreme. It conveys a more active curation of what's flowing in the pipes. Okay, but I think for me a relatively more accurate way to sort of is to call them mediators. Yeah, they are mediating the flow of information. They may not necessarily mediate.
But let's
Um,
have to play devil's advocate. Twitter's decision to suspend Donald Trump's accounts. That doesn't seem like mediation. That seems like a very conscious editorial call not to publish somebody.
and that's an example of gatekeeping. Yeah. But is that the I mean, how prominent is that kind of response by the intermediaries? Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
that's
maybe not that common, but when it does happen, it does bring into question this mediating role.
of course. So if we talk at the extremes in terms of when we talk about examples of which might be exceptions, and that's the reason why I'm talking about them, that they are exceptions there. So there could be also scenarios whereby some of them might have a more strong editorial role to play. Okay, and there are cases where they'll have a much stronger gatekeeping role to play. But then I
Let me
think
ask
this,
you a normative question, Vibod. Let me ask you the normative question in terms of, if you wanted a free and fair digital media that doesn't manipulate elections, but only provides the information that allows voters to go out and make choices, what would you have social media companies do? Would you like them to be pure intermediaries and do nothing? Would you like them to mediate? Would you like them to take on a stronger editorial function? What kind of role would you envisage for them?
well, if you are talking about a scenario where there is actually perfect competition,
Mhm.
which normally exists only in textbooks, then I think an intermediary role would actually be appropriate. Yeah. But we don't function in a perfect world, and we don't function under conditions of perfect competition. Yeah. So perhaps one has to look at this a little bit more closely. Yeah. Um, what are the incentives that they have to perform a pure instrumentally intermediary role there? Are those incentives much bigger than the incentives for them to sort of perform these other kinds of roles. Yeah.
So what are those incentives in your view?
Well, the incentives largely are perhaps in terms of different types of buyers here. I mean, there's no question about that. And these buyers perhaps would range from buyers to on formal political actors, on different kind of social forces, on commercial forces, uh, and perhaps also on extra constitutional forces. Yeah. So these biases are not new. These biases did exist when we talk about legacy media.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
right.
so these are not new kind of biases. It's just that if you start thinking about um this kind of abstract entity called an algorithm and blame these kind of slants and biases on them, on that entity, then perhaps we are sort of thinking about it in a very different kind of way. So the obligation to ensure that information is flowing freely, which of course is one of the founding tenets of the internet. Okay, and somehow between 1996, when the first charters of the internet was written, to now, we seem to have sort of moved away from this normative idea or even an operational idea of free flow of information to the flow of information. Yeah. And I think that perhaps is worrying. And this, of course, goes beyond news as well. Yeah, I mean, if you look at
Absolutely.
non-news media content, again, it's not necessarily flowing purely as unbiased entities. Let me give an example. Yeah, you read newspapers. I read newspapers. The vendor who comes in the morning to give newspapers. Yeah, okay. Assuming you have subscribed to 4 newspapers, and what happens one day that he gives you only 3 newspapers. Okay, that obviously then that vendor is no longer purely an instrumental element in the value chain. Yeah, that vendor perhaps might have been incentivized to not deliver certain kind of newspapers. Yeah, and this happened very much in the so-called newspaper war in Delhi in the 1990s, I beg your pardon, between the Hindustan Times and the Times of India. Yeah. And those who were, in a sense, at the forefront of this were those who were trying to use the newspaper boy uh, as the site where you gatekeep information. Okay. So again, for me, I mean, I start keep thinking about these free digital comparable practices so that we can make these things a bit more easily visualized. We can visualize them more easily.
That's
Okay.
right. I think it's
Uh,
an interesting analogy to think of Twitter as newspaper boys at scale. I think it's an interesting, very interesting way of of looking at it, and it's of course it's been my long held view that one of these key incentives is that, and this is goes well beyond news, is that products that are bought digitally should have a price, and this is this myth of the free product, the free news publication on the internet, and this kind of has skewed the market in a way that that I think has created a perverse set of incentives for big tech organizations as well to act in certain ways. And I think that I've written on this as well. That news on the internet should also have a price, as some newspapers have done and moved to a subscription-based model. Uh, my sense is that that's a possible direction in which we might go, but that's an entirely different debate, and I don't
well,
want to get.
sorry to interrupt, but I think nothing is free. I mean, I
That's
start
right.
from that. So it's
I mean, if
just
something
that,
is free, then you're the product.
or it's free to me because somebody else in the value chain
Is paying for it.
is paying for
Absolutely.
that, or
Absolutely.
there are other ways in which I'm gaining product A in one particular market, but I'm losing out, or I'm being monetized in another market to realize value. Yeah, and this is quite common. Value which is lost in one market tends to be gained by companies in other markets. Yeah,
That's right.
and this
Absolutely.
perhaps is an interesting way of looking at the constraints that news organizations are
And
facing.
sometimes the price that we pay for this so-called free product is essentially a lack of trust. And a lack of trust not just in relation to the digital news that we receive, but a lack of trust in relation to the news that we receive altogether. And so, as I started this show by saying, and we'll end with this, with the final question to Vibodh, that trust in news media is at a low of 38%. This is really low. People don't trust what they are reading. And how do you think, if at all, if you are optimistic about it, how do you think news media, and here I'm talking about traditional news media, how will they be able to regain the trust of their readership or their viewership?
I think the trade-off that they need to make is whether they are happy with the lower trust that they are confronted with, but they are getting higher revenues there. And I think these two discussions on the loss of trust and loss of revenues tend to happen in different rooms there. Okay, so there could be scenarios whereby a news outlet is, in a sense, in the ranking of trust pretty low, but in the ranking of revenues they are pretty high here. So they are willing to let go one value if they get value in a different kind of way. So that's at the big picture here. The other issue, of course, this is that those who are bothered about this issue as to why they are kind of losing trust uh, is something, in a sense, needs to go back to the basics of the news media. Is that, are they investing significantly uh, in gathering and distributing information, which otherwise is being gathered and distributed by unorthodox actors here? So there's been a tremendous decline in news gathering, both in newspapers and in broadcast news. Much more obvious in broadcast news because we really don't have, we have a very small part in the programming cycle of broadcast news which actually is gathered there. The rest, most of it comes from agencies or it comes from discussions. So I think going back to investing in news gathering, uh, that would then rival the quote unquote news coming from the other information market, is one way in which perhaps trust would come back to them. Yeah.
Let's look at that. I think that's a positive note to end it on. Newspapers and other traditional media houses really need to think about how they're making the trade-off between providing accurate information and generating revenues, and ultimately must go back to investing in what they are meant for, which is providing news. But that really is dependent on whether news and newspapers perform a public, think of themselves as performing a public function, or are they just another business that is there to ensure revenues at the end of the day? Where does this balance lie? This is a vexed question. It will continue to remain one, but I hope it is one that will not unduly determine the results of the next general elections. There's room for hope, but at the same time, we must all remain wary and cautious. Thanks very much, Vibodh, for the wonderfully wide-ranging discussions that we had, and it's always a pleasure to hear you. And it was really, really heartening to have you on Justify. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Argo. I really enjoyed this chat. Yeah.
As we close, here is today's Free and Fair, our special audience poll where you, as a listener, get to exercise your franchise. Today's question: can the government of India effectively regulate big media houses? Vote yes or no. To cast your vote, visit my Twitter account, that's @Orgo_justify, or Vidhi's LinkedIn page. You have 48 hours, so go out and vote. Adjourn.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, follow us on Twitter @Vidhi_India for regular updates. We are on SoundCloud and Spotify as Vidhi Center for Legal Policies podcast. You can also listen to us on Google Podcasts or iTunes. Email us at justify@vidhilegalpolicy.in to share your comments and feedback on this episode.